Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to our second holiday bonus episode of 2024. This week, we'll be talking with a former British diplomat, Leigh Turner, about his star-studded career and his new book, Lessons in Diplomacy: Politics, Power, and Parties, released in September 2024. Find the book in our show notes, as well as links to Leigh's blog and website. In this interview, we discuss a wide range of topics, from crisis and safety issues facing embassies around the world to how technology is transforming the role of the diplomat, and how he sees European, Russian, and British foreign policy developing in the next few years.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
I'm delighted to be joined by former British Ambassador Leigh Turner. Leigh Turner is a writer based in London. He was the UK ambassador to Austria and UK permanent representative to the United Nations in Vienna from September 2016 to September 2021. Leigh's previous roles were as Her Majesty's Consul General in Istanbul and Director General for Trade and Investment for Turkey, Central Asia, and the South Caucasus, Her Majesty's Ambassador to Kyiv, Ukraine, and Director of Overseas Territories in London, responsible for territories including St Helena, the Falklands, and Bermuda. Leigh grew up in Nigeria, Exeter, and Lesotho before his education in Swaziland, Manchester, and Cambridge. After hitchhiking around 27 states in America in 1979, Leigh had a 42-year diplomatic career, from which he draws upon in his September 2024 book, Lessons in Diplomacy. He is the author of 3 thrillers as well, including Blood Summit, set in Berlin, and a collection of feminist black comedies, 7 Hotel Stories. He is also a former writer for the Financial Times. Leigh has lectured at the Oxford University Diplomatic Studies Program, King's College London, University College London, Cambridge, the LSE, University of York, Vienna University, the Free University of Amsterdam, and the Danube University Krems, and is a visiting professor at Graz University. Let's listen in on the conversation. All right, folks, welcome back to this bonus episode of Diplomatic Immunity over the holiday break. I'm excited to be joined today by former British Ambassador Leigh Turner. Leigh has just published a book called Lessons in Diplomacy: Politics, Power, and Parties. And we're going to talk to him about the book today, some of his experiences working for the British Foreign Office, and some thoughts he has on broader issues of diplomacy and foreign policy. So, Ambassador Turner, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's great to be with you, Kelly. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, definitely. And I finished the book up a few days ago. Thoroughly enjoyed it. A lot of good stories. You've had a fascinating career, I have to say. You've served in, when you look back, you've served in a lot of the places that are extremely important today, whether it be Hong Kong or Moscow or Kyiv. You've been all over the place. And we'll get to that in a bit. But I kind of wanted to start with some broader questions about diplomacy and foreign policy. And you spend a little bit of time in the book talking about sort of crisis moments and different threats and issues of safety that you and your colleagues have dealt with over the years and through your tenure. And I know from a U.S. perspective, there's been a lot of discussion in the U.S., at least since 9/11, and then again following Benghazi, about the difficulty for diplomats to what we call get out beyond the walls and meet with people. And, that's extremely important. You don't just want to meet with the government contacts that you have that are going to tell you the government line, and especially depending on what kind of regime is in place or what kind of government that you're dealing with. You want to be able to talk to people and get a feel for what's really happening on the ground. So how have you dealt with that through your tenure? And then how do you think folks need to sort of address that in some of these more difficult places to work?
Sure. Well, clearly, diplomacy is all about people. It's about getting to know people, everybody from the citizens of the country that you're in up to the highest decision makers, the leaders of that country or opposition policymakers, all kinds of people. And they are absolutely essential to get to know them, to try and influence them, to think the things that you want them to think, and often to achieve things. So they're so central. I always think of the occasion when I was in Vienna as ambassador and we had COVID-19 hit. All of a sudden, we had hundreds of British citizens who were so-called saisonnières. That meant they were holiday workers working in the Alps in Austria. And because the Austrians had been accused of unleashing COVID through their ski resorts, they were very unwilling to let these young Brits go home. So they were all stuck in these Austrian ski resorts. And we acted with the government, we acted with the ministry, we could not get them out. And then I remembered a young guy who I'd met in the cabinet of the health minister, a very junior official, and I rang him up and asked him, any ideas what we can do? And he said, yeah, sure, get in touch with the governors of those regions. They're the people who can get your people out. So we did that, and we were the first country to get our saisonniers out. All the other countries, Germany, Italy, France, etc., started phoning me up saying, how did you do that? I literally had to sign a little mini treaty with the state of Vorarlberg to drive a car with 4 people in it across the provincial boundary. And it all boiled down to knowing that young man, who I later, by the way, invited for lunch to say thank you very much when COVID had died down a bit. But this is what we're doing. And so it's a real problem when you can't get out of your building. And in a way, when you're faced with these dangerous environments, you have to make a lot of very tough judgment calls. I remember my colleague in Belarus during the time of very serious long-term protests against the government in Belarus, the authoritarian government of Lukashenko, wanting to go out and witness the demonstrations. And the Belarus authorities got more and more violent and eventually started attacking the diplomats as well, who were observing these protests, even though they should have been inviolable. And one of the diplomats, not a British diplomat, was quite seriously injured, and they had to reassess their position. Or when I was in Istanbul during the Gezi Park protests, I actually made a wrong call. And after the first day of the protests, when our compound in the center of Istanbul had been full of tear gas and things seemed to have died down, I went out with one of the security guys from the gatehouse. I was the only person living there. It was a Sunday afternoon. And I went out and I walked down Istiklal to Gezi Park to see what was happening. And it was very dramatic. Lots of big crowds, lots of overturned police cars and smashed up construction equipment. And with hindsight, that was a mistake. I should have stayed where I was. And I think the rule there then is make your assessment, but also be ready to mitigate for danger. And that includes not telling people where you're going to be in future. It includes knowing when you should do nothing. And that means, in that case, for example, in Istanbul, I should have stayed inside the compound. The problem is that crowded places and trouble spots may be exactly where you want to be.
Yeah, and I appreciate the fact that you did admit in the book that maybe that wasn't the right call, because a lot of times when people write, memoirs or things like that, it's you look throughout the 300-page book and you're like, wow, that person never made a mistake. That was amazing.
He was always right. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think you make an interesting point too. It's not just about working in dangerous areas and trying to get outside the walls to meet with people and everything. It's also, if you're in a place like Vienna, once you reach a certain level, and you were the ambassador there, making sure that you're not just talking to the foreign minister and the deputy foreign minister and people at that level, and making sure that you're building relationships with lower level folks and talking with people across the board, which ended up being much more useful for you in that case than knowing the foreign minister or people at that level. So I think that comes through as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Of course, it's a huge privilege being a diplomat or being a head of mission in an overseas mission, because you do have that access at the very top of the system. I mean, when I was in Kyiv, I would have regular lunches with the prime minister, or in Vienna, I got to know the president quite well, with great privilege, great honor. And yet at the same time, if you only see those people, you're absolutely right. You'll get a very skewed impression of what the country is like.
Yeah. So you talk in your book as well towards the end about the importance of training for diplomats and also foreign office reform. And here in the US, we're about to go through a presidential transition, and there haven't been many reports come around this time, but back in 2020, there was a rash of reports on State Department reform and foreign affairs reform and things like this. In practice, these efforts have been mostly hit or miss. But more opportunities for training was one of the key recommendations in many of the reports. Having worked for the State Department before, there are very few opportunities for training once you are trained either as a foreign service officer or as a civil servant. Very unlike our military colleagues who, take large chunks of time out of their careers to go do training, to go think and really and study and do those sorts of things. That's lacking in the State Department, in the Foreign Service, and Civil Service. So that was, a key recommendation and should be. And you talk about that in your book, increased training. But where do you see the areas that are ripe for reform in entities like the Foreign Office and the State Department, especially in a world that is changing very rapidly?
Sure. Well, I say in the book, if you think lifelong learning sounds dull, you're not doing it right. And it's very striking if you're an airline pilot or if you're a doctor or if you're a psychoanalyst, you're expected continually to refresh your training and to refresh your qualifications. And the same should be true of diplomats. Certainly in the British Overseas Service, there is a very strong tradition of encouraging everybody to do regular training right up to the top. I mean, before my final posting, I was doing additional security training, additional training in various areas, media training, and so on, because these things do evolve as time goes on. And I'd say there's two kinds of big change or reform which happen. There are, first of all, the regular, constant change that is brought about by technology and just the changing nature of society. If you look at the British service, I was looking this up the other day. In 1844, two things happened. One was that the British embassy in what was then Constantinople opened, 1844, magnificent, huge building. It's still there, Pera House. Also in 1844, the first functioning telegraph was introduced. Now, a couple of years later, there was a big fire in Istanbul, and it was believed that the building had burned down. Actually, it was still most of it standing. And the Times ran a huge editorial, a thundering editorial, where they said basically, why do we even need ambassadors when we have the telegraph? We can send them instruction anytime, wherever they are in the world. We don't need important, highly paid people living in huge palaces to make decisions anymore. And they had a point, and these changes will constantly come about. If we look at in the book, I think there's a chapter called "How to Make Diplomacy Reflect a Changing World," which is all about how there are more women in the diplomatic service than there used to be. Until 1972 in Britain, a woman who got married, who was in the diplomatic service, had to resign. Openly gay officers weren't allowed until 1994. So these changes are coming, and they're very welcome, but they're kind of organic. They're happening anyway. And maybe, Kelly, what you're talking about is more the kind of active reform effort. Here's the Foreign Office, here's the State Department. We are going to change it. And I think you're right in suggesting that those reform efforts are really tough. And part of this is because for an organization like the State Department or the Foreign Office, it's spread across hundreds of missions in up to 200 countries, 193 members of the UN at the moment, I think, and of course international organizations as well. And each diplomat who's posted to any of those places has a training cycle of several years. They have a posting cycle. Once they move, it's very hard to move them again. Their family's gone there. Their children are in school. It's really difficult to reform them. And there was a great example of this in the British Foreign Office when a very lively chief executive took over who came up with the slogan, "More foreign, less office." He said there's too much stuff at headquarters. We need more people out there in the regions, in the countries doing stuff. And in particular, we need to take resources out of Europe where everybody is so expensive. We have these big legacy embassies left over from the 19th century. Let's put them into Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, these growth areas. And so a huge convulsion took place in the Foreign Office. And after about 5 years, about 20 people had been moved. And this was hailed as a great triumph. And then shortly after that, we had the Brexit referendum. And people said, Brexit, we're going to need more people in Europe to deal with all the bilateral stuff. So more people were put in to deal with Brexit. And then 5 years later, after that, 2021, Brexit was done. But those people are still there in the embassy. Those extra resources, they're still kicking their heels in embassies across Europe. So it's really, really tough. And I don't see any easy way to do this that isn't going to leave blood on the carpet, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's definitely an inertia involved with trying to reform in a big entity like the Foreign Office or the State Department, and I think in systems like ours too, part of it is the changing party system. You might have different viewpoints every 4 years, so it's hard to even get a consistent viewpoint on what that reform should look like, what it should be, how to enact it, and then actually move it through and have a period of time long enough to actually see it through before it changes again. So it makes life difficult.
One of the changes you mentioned on training, I do think there's an interesting distinction to be made between generalists and specialists here, where in the UK system, there is a tradition of generalists, people who have studied the classics even. Latin, Greek, and ancient history were deemed to be people who had a good understanding of the world, good at learning languages. And then when I joined the Foreign Office in 1983, we had 21 new entrants in the kind of graduate stream, 21 different degree subjects. So very much generalists. If you look at the Chinese or the Russians, they tend to have very tightly bundled specialists who will focus on one area for their entire career. And I often felt that, for example, the Russians working in the United Nations had a lot of training in the laws and the rules of the United Nations. So they were quite good at tying people up in knots and causing procedural delays and this kind of thing. Whereas the Chinese that we were dealing with on Hong Kong, they'd done nothing but Hong Kong for their entire careers. And in some areas of policy, it's really important to know what happened 20 years ago or to understand the precedents and so on. And I think the direction we're going is probably more in the direction of more specialization rather than less.
Yeah, I know that's a reoccurring conversation within the State Department as well, because Foreign Service officers are supposed to be more generalists. You'll have people that end up spending a larger amount of their career within a region, but they're not necessarily coming from school with a master's degree in African studies and then going in and being a specialist in Africa. And coming at it from a historian's perspective, I do think there needs to be some sort of balancing out between everybody's a generalist or everybody's a specialist, because you're right, you need somebody that can come in and see it through the bigger picture of what else is going on in the world and what the home office thinks, and like what's going on, if you're serving in China, but you've just been in Russia, like what they're thinking and putting all that stuff together.
Absolutely.
But then you also need that institutional memory that comes with being a specialist. You mentioned technology in your book, and how you adapted and adopted social media, but now we're coming into the age of AI, and that's what everybody's talking about. So how did you adapt to the changing technological landscape throughout your career? But then also, what's the feel amongst your cohort of ambassadors in the UK, and where do they see the future going with AI? Are they like, oh my God, we're not going to have a job, or like this isn't really going to affect us?
Yeah, it's a mixture of both, isn't it? I think these things go in cycles. And on the one hand, there are enormous gains to be uh, made from the introduction of different social media platforms. I remember back in 2009, what's that, only 15 years ago, I started writing my first blog. And in those days, this was seen to be pretty radical. This was when I was ambassador in Ukraine. And it became defining. I would literally experience some event. I would go on a call or go to see some event, and I would write a blog about it. And then after I'd written and published my blog, I would then write a report back to London about it. So it became quite primary. And when the blog began to be carried in all the major Ukrainian websites and news sites and news media, I would find that any Ukrainian minister who I met would have read my blog that day, and they would know exactly what I was saying. So I would get thousands and thousands of comments on these blogs. So that was like the beginning of it all. And then you had Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. TikTok is the one I'm using most at the moment as an author. I find it's amazing for getting feedback. I'm waiting to see if it gets blocked in the US. That'll be interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
I think a lot of people are waiting to see that. Yeah.
And, if the job of the diplomat is to get to know people and to influence them, gather information about them, as I was saying before, make outreach, these are really important platforms, and we need to be familiar with them and using them to the best we can, while acknowledging that they're only part of the scene, and that, a hybrid presentation, for example, getting in some influencers on TikTok into the embassy and talking to them and getting them to take pictures of what you're doing in the embassy may be a great way to get the news out, or some very old-fashioned things, the one-to-one breakfast meeting, the salon in Vienna. I had a salon to which I used to invite the great and the good, and they loved it. How old-fashioned is that? And one of my major forms of influence. So all of that is happening on one side, and I'd say we should see social media as a very important weapon in our armory for being diplomats. On the other hand, there is the way that social media as a whole is forming people's opinions. And I go onto some social media platforms, I won't say which ones, but we may call them the, until recently, very important, but now more of legacy platforms. And you see the debate that is raging there, and you think the people who are on this platform have no understanding at all of what is happening in the world. I'm sometimes confronted when I talk to students by people who come up with the most bizarre conspiracy theories. And this tsunami of disinformation, some of it state sponsored, some of it naturally evolving, some of it evolving because people find that saying the most extreme things will get them the most clicks and the most money. This tsunami of disinformation is a challenge to all of us. I'd say it's the biggest threat facing our democracies in the 21st century. And trying to come to grips with that and to keep trusted sources of news media that people can refer to find out what's going on is going to be a huge challenge for us. And we're going to have to use the very mechanisms which are destroying trust in established media in order to generate trust in established media. So it's an interlocked series of opportunities and challenges, I'd say.
Yeah, and for diplomats, I find that it presents an even more unique challenge potentially, because there's a lot of discussion these days about the potential for the creation of different technological blocks out there that have sort of their own echo chambers and visions of reality because of the U.S. maybe cutting itself off from China, and then China creating their own broader internet world, and the West creating our broader internet world. And then as diplomats, how you try to cross over those if people are sort of in their own echo chambers that are even potentially worse than they are today, of like what is reality and what's real and not, has the potential to be a daunting exercise, especially as more and more people get their information and news from social media.
I agree completely. And I think you mentioned AI there, Kelly. And I think the way that AI can be trained to create credible deepfake images, deepfake voices, any words can be put into the mouth of any politician. We can see tailored little movies or videos being made directed to each of 1,000 different people who have 1,000 different views, and they get 1,000 different videos, which each of them is designed to persuade them to believe X or Y. In fact, I just recently completed a thriller on this very subject. I write thrillers in my spare time. Unfortunately, it's not yet sold, but it's a huge burgeoning area, and the idea that we could all lose connection with reality is a very concerning one. And your idea of different echo chambers where you have, let's say, a Russian diplomat and a US diplomat trying to have a conversation on the basis of completely different understandings of the world is daunting. Although one might also argue, of course, that this has been happening for many years, and that the understanding of the world of a Chinese diplomat, British diplomat, has never been exactly the same.
Yes, for sure. We will see how this plays out. I mean, obviously, that's the most negative potential outlook you could have out there. So hopefully that doesn't come to fruition. But I think it does speak to, and you mentioned it too, how you train AI, I think is going to be extremely important, and making sure you're giving it the right tools, the right diversity, and all those different things to train it the right way. Whereas, China is training it in a way that, there's no information about 1989 and Tiananmen Square in the AI because it doesn't want the AI to give an answer like that. So we'll see where that goes.
It's very Orwellian, isn't it? You're really able to rewrite the past.
Yes, we'll talk more about history in a bit here, but moving on to some more specific areas where you did serve and issues that you did serve on, and we'll start in your home area of Europe and the EU. So Brexit, it's been a while now. The UK is formally out of the EU. Since you were dealing with those issues, Russia has invaded Ukraine. We have the return of Donald Trump to the presidency in the United States. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of what that time period was like for you working on EU issues as the UK was moving out of the EU, but then also kind of looking forward, where do you see the EU at this moment?
I talk a lot about this in my book, Lessons in Diplomacy, that being the Brexit ambassador, as it was in Vienna from 2016 to 2021, right through from just after the referendum in the UK in early 2016, right through to after we'd left on the 31st of January 2020, that was both a nightmare and a privilege. It was a nightmare because I was working for a government that didn't know what it wanted, didn't really have a policy on Brexit. I tell people that our lines to take that we had on what is Brexit literally included the phrase, Brexit means Brexit. Grown up politicians were saying this to explain our position. And nobody really knew what it was until 2019 when Boris Johnson was elected in a general election on the basis of what we called a hard Brexit. So, really cutting off many more ties with the EU than was strictly necessary. And all that time, I was trying to explain to people in Austria, including many Brits, around 11,000 British citizens who lived in Austria, most of whom hated the idea of Brexit because it was going to give them less rights than they'd had before, explaining to them what was going on and why it was all okay. So it was a huge challenge. At the same time, it was a privilege and a bonus because the Austrians were fascinated by what they saw as a massive act of self-harm by the United Kingdom. Why the hell are the British doing this to themselves, shooting themselves in both feet and then in the knees and then in the head? Um, and so everybody wanted to talk to me about it, whether it was the news media or very, very senior politicians who would invite me in for a quiet cup of coffee and a chat about what the hell was going on. So this was, in a way, a bonus as well. It was both a challenge and a bonus, a very kind of flexible thing. At the end of the day, I wish Brexit hadn't happened, but given that it was happening, it was a fascinating area to work on. I mean, in terms of where the EU is going, I think it's a time with a newly elected President Trump coming in January. We have China posing all sorts of security and economic challenges. We have a reckless, fragile Russia, which seems to be prepared to take enormous risks in its pursuit of trying to keep President Putin on his throne. And all of these challenges should lead to an EU which is more cohesive in this dangerous, difficult, complex world, where EU member states can see that they need to work together to maintain agency in these turbulent waters. At the same time, the EU is always prone to stress and tensions from within. Different EU member states have different ideas on where it should be going. There is always this debate between those EU member states who believe the EU should become more integrated, more of a single unit with a single currency and a single foreign policy, maybe even a single EU army, and those member states who see it more as a trading association, a loose bloc, and want to have maximum national power. And that debate, to some extent, is as old as the hills. To another extent, it's going to keep on coming back to us. And unless the leadership of the EU can persuade all people in the EU to sign up for one version or another, the risk is that the EU will not be able to implement cohesive and effective policies.
Yeah, and things aren't going to get easier moving forward. You mentioned China and the strategic and economic challenges they present to the EU. But you also worked on you've worked in many areas that are now geopolitical hotspots. I'm not blaming you for that, but
It's all my fault.
but I found it fascinating that you worked on the handover with Hong Kong in 1997, historical moment in Chinese history, Hong Kong history, British history. So, talk to us a little bit about that. What was that like? I mean, did you understand at the moment that you were working in this historic moment? And then, how have things gone in your mind for Hong Kong? Has it kind of gone the way you had foreseen, or has it turned out differently? And then, well, just to add on more questions for you, just kind of what your views on China in general as a challenger to today's system in the West.
Quite some questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Looking first of all at Hong Kong, I joined the Hong Kong Department of the Foreign Office in 1995. And this was 16 years after negotiations had started. There were actually 18 years of negotiations altogether from 1979 up until 1997 on the handover of Hong Kong, starting with agreement on the Joint Declaration in 1984, which introduced the concept of one country, two systems, and Hong Kong retaining a high degree of autonomy for 50 years after 1997. So that was the basic idea. And then we were negotiating on all sorts of details, everything from how the airport would work to the new 3G telephone licenses, very up to date in those days, the harbour tunnel, all kinds of things. And some of those issues were fundamental to how Hong Kong was going to work. There were long debates about the establishment of the Hong Kong Supreme Court, where the Brits were pushing for, the United Kingdom was pushing for a Supreme Court which could trump the government in Beijing. And the government in Beijing, of course, was having none of this, and insisted that they must have the ultimate say in Hong Kong. So the opposite of our court systems in the United Kingdom and in the United States, of course. So it was always a very delicate set of negotiations, and we were always on a knife edge as 1997 approached. How would China manage Hong Kong? And for the first few years, it seemed things were going pretty well, I would say. There was still complete freedom of speech in Hong Kong. There was quite a degree of democracy. Arguably, the UK should have done more to introduce more democracy earlier. Um, but generally, things rolled on pretty well for about 17 years until about 2014. And for all of this time, the UK was writing 6 monthly reports actually on the implementation of the Joint Declaration, paragraph by paragraph. I can claim credit for this being my idea, and those reports are still written, by the way, much to the hatred of China, who says it's nothing to do with us and they're a sovereign country. But in 2014, Beijing introduced new rules on how elections should be held in Hong Kong, leading to a lot of protests. And then there was a new national security law that China introduced after 2019, introducing the possibility that Hong Kong citizens could be tried for political crimes in China.
Mm-hmm.
This led to huge protests in Hong Kong, both of these developments. And really, around that time, China started interfering in the running of Hong Kong in ways that the United Kingdom government declared were clearly against the letter and the spirit of the Joint Declaration. So really the Joint Declaration has been thoroughly undermined by China now. And one of the interesting things that happened was that back in 1997, there was a debate over whether Hong Kong British citizens, of whom there were around 3.5 million out of a population of around 6.5 million in Hong Kong, whether those British citizens should get the right to live in the UK. They didn't have it. They had the right of visa-free travel, but not the right of abode in the UK. And back in 1997, the British government said, well, 3.5 million people, that's a lot. And both the main parties said this was impossible. But in 2019, when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, one of the first things he did was to introduce a new immigration route for those very same British nationals overseas to come to the UK. And I just looked up the figures before this call, and it's now more than 144,000 Hong Kong citizens have migrated from from Hong Kong to the UK since 2000 and since it was introduced in 2021, the actual Finnish scheme. Huge number, actually. And so there's a lot going on in Hong Kong. And I discuss this in the book. Why is it that China cares so much about what happens in Hong Kong? This little tiny place, 6 million people compared with 1.4 billion Chinese. And the answer, of course, is a bit like Ukraine and Russia. Russia, or Vladimir Putin at least, is terrified of democracy in Ukraine spreading into Russia and throwing him out of a job and into some very uncertain future, in the same way that the leaders of China are very worried about democracy spreading from Hong Kong into China itself. And the 20th century was not kind to China in terms of the terrible destruction and chaos that instability brought about. And they are neuralgic about it.
Yeah, from a Chinese Communist Party perspective and from a Putin perspective, you're absolutely right. Like having a democratic rule of law place that's right across the border, people start looking and say, well, hey, how come they get to do this and we don't?
Yeah, I mean, I always say Putin was very relaxed about Ukraine being in the EU and so on until he had his own Bolotnaya protests in 2011 to 2013 and suddenly thought, hey, I could be overthrown. I mean, coming back to China, on the one hand, they have this incredible economic achievement since Deng Xiaoping's reforms introduced around 1980, that their economy has grown massively. There's a great statistic, I don't know if you've heard this one, that in 1991, the Russian economy was around a third bigger than China's economy, 1991. And it's now the Chinese economy is 10 times bigger than the Russian economy. And in the process of that happening, 850 million Chinese people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. So
It's crazy to wrap your head around.
it's absolutely phenomenal. And all credit to the Chinese people and the Chinese authorities that they've made that possible. But they now face some big challenges. And one of these is the usual middle income trap. Can they break through having achieved a fairly high income and very high income in some places like Shanghai and Beijing? Or are they going to get stuck? And we've seen slower growth in recent years. So that's one set of issues which is putting pressure on the leadership. Another big set of issues is the demographic question, where I'm a bit of a nerd on this. I was inspired by a story I saw in The Lancet, which is a kind of medical specialist magazine in the UK, very highly regarded, in 2020, which forecast that the Chinese population would fall by roughly 50% by 2100 to around 731 million, an incredible fall. And then I've been following this, and there's an institution called the Shanghai Academy of Social Science, which publishes annual updates. And in January 2024, they forecast a population by 2100 of 525 million.
Wow.
So getting on for a third of the current population. And these are eye-watering figures. Of course, it's a long way in the future and a lot of things can change, but China has a real huge demographic problem. And then the third big question that we all should be asking ourselves is, can China avoid doing a Russia and getting itself into ultra destructive foreign policy adventures? And in particular, can China avoid the trap of a military adventure to try and recapture Taiwan, which would put at risk all of that economic growth we've seen, all of the stability that we see in China, and for what? To gain some kind of control over this island that they see as being part of China. If China doesn't do that, I think the Chinese people will see that they have a pretty steady, solid bout of continued economic growth ahead of them. If there is a war, everything will be up for grabs. That's really opening the Pandora's box for them, and it'll be very difficult to predict what effect that might have on China. So those would be my three things, the middle income trap, demographic issues, and whether China can avoid entanglement in foreign conflicts.
Yeah, and when you're the CCP and your number one priority is regime stability, all three of those issues present a problem. So it will be interesting to see how they try to counteract that and also don't overstep things in coming years.
Absolutely right. I mean, the role of President Xi is also very interesting. I think he's been there since 2012, and that probably more by chance than anything he's done, has coincided with a period of slowing economic growth. And then there is the question of his trying to take on increasing powers over time. He's getting a more centralized system. The CCP has a tradition of having these huge meetings, and within the party, there's some degree of discussion and trying to come up with good ideas, which has served them pretty well over the last 40 years. But now Xi is taking on more powers, and that seems to have coincided with some pretty duff decisions on the economy. So that's another very interesting factor.
So, moving from one authoritarian to another, you also very interestingly served in Russia during the 90s. So, I'd love to hear you talk about what that was like, because we've all heard the stories and the talk of the Wild West of the 1990s and things like that. But also, more importantly, for what we're dealing with today in Vladimir Putin and his invasion of Ukraine, how did the issues of the 90s sort of set the stage for somebody like Putin to come in and take control and then continue doing what he's done for the past, 24 years now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I have a chapter in the book called How Not to Introduce Democracy, which is all about the Russian reforms of the early 90s, which I was first Secretary Economic in the embassy from 1992 to 95, the British Embassy in Moscow. And the statistics are amazing. Between 1990 and 1999, the Russian economy collapsed in constant dollars from $517 billion to $196 billion. So an absolute economic collapse over 9 years. And during that same 9 years, the Polish economy grew from 66 to 170 billion. So it was nearly as big as the Russian economy by 1999. And the reason was that Poland introduced these economic reforms helped by Jeffrey Sachs and with strong help from the US and the EU and other countries, and pushed them through. Whereas in Russia, the entrenched interests of the nomenclatura, call them what you will, the bigwigs in the Russian system, managed to stop reform from happening, even though it was the same Jeffrey Sachs who was trying to implement it. And it completely collapsed. There's this great quote by Yegor Gaidar, who was the Russian prime minister at the time, who said, "The IMF keeps telling us to tighten our belts, but in fact, we have no belts, or indeed trousers as such." There's a series of stories in the book about how awful it was. Everything from the fact there was no petrol, no gas in Russian gas stations. I remember going to a gas station with my little Lada Niva, with my tiny child in the back, aged 6 months, on a cold Russian winter night with my empty tank, and asking them, "Do you have any gas?" And the guy said no. And I said, "Well, would $10 refresh your memory?" And he said, "Oh yeah, we do have one canister." So this was like 1,000% markup. So he went and got a jerry can and started filling up our tank with this much sought after fuel. And as he was doing this, another Russian came walking by and saw this, and he said, "Oh, you've got some gas." And the petrol station attendant said, "No." It's an absolute classic. So things were absolutely dire, and that led, of course, to we had the putsch of 1991 against Gorbachev, who was at that point still leader of the Soviet Union, and then in 1993, during the time I was actually in Moscow, we had the putsch against Yeltsin, and 2023. Actually, exactly 30 years later, we had the putsch by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner mercenary group, against Putin. So the big question is, first of all, did this economic turmoil fuel Putin? And the answer is, of course, yes, because people in Russia longed for stability and somebody who could put the country in order. And Vladimir Putin came in. He reorganized things. There's a debate about whether he cut down on corruption or whether he just kind of streamlined it so you knew who you had to pay. And Russia became more stable. People were able to rely on their paychecks coming in. So that gave him a lot of goodwill. But as a bit like in China, actually, as Russia got wealthier, its economic growth began to slow. and was based entirely on raw materials exports, particularly oil and gas.
Hmm.
So Putin then turned to these foreign adventures, a bit like Argentina invading the Falklands in 1982, to take the people's attention off what was happening at home. Same thing, Putin goes and invades Crimea in 2014 and the rest of Ukraine in 2022.
Syria in 2015.
Syria 2015, trying to take people's minds off the fact that he can't generate enough economic growth. And I think really Putin has made so many mistakes since 2013. I said earlier that really everything changed in 2013 when he first told President Yanukovych of Ukraine, who had been negotiating for 3 years with the EU to sign an association agreement
Hmm.
without Putin saying anything. Putin at no point objected to this. And then suddenly in 2013, after these Bolotnaya protests, Putin said, nope, nope, you can't sign that. And that led to the Maidan in Ukraine. It led to the flight of President Yanukovych, a bit like the flight of President Assad we've just seen, and Russia losing Ukraine. As an observer in Ukraine said when Russia occupied Crimea in 2014, he said, you may have won Crimea, but you've lost Ukraine. And Ukraine, which used to be quite friendly towards Russia up until 2014, is now full of embittered Ukrainians who absolutely hate Putin and Russia and are desperate to belong to the West.
Yeah, there's a growing number of authoritarians that are living in a timeshare in Moscow these days. Yeah, so we're running short on time here, but I want to get you out of here on one last question because I would, as a historian and somebody who teaches a class on history's influence on foreign affairs, I would be remiss to not ask you about the role of history and how you've seen it over your decades as a member of the Foreign Office and as an ambassador. And you talk about it in your book in the case of China and Russia. But just in your mind, how important is history in all of its aspects when you're a diplomat, but also just in foreign affairs in general?
History is absolutely fundamental for diplomats and anybody dealing with foreign affairs. I say in the book there are three things that any diplomat must do. Number one is you've got to be an expert, and that includes really knowing about what you're dealing with, and history is fundamental to that. The other two things, by the way, are focusing on people and taking your time coming to decisions, which is the most difficult of all, perhaps. But yeah, coming back to history, I'd say there's two kind of important parts of this. One is how important history is to the people that you're dealing with. And some examples of this included with the overseas territories. I was director of overseas territories, places like the Falklands, Bermuda, Turks and Caicos Islands, St Helena, and so on. And they often would be absolutely expert on key elements of their history, which had happened a long time ago. So, two examples of that would be in the Falklands, where they were absolutely focused on the Argentine invasion of 1982, something that for people of my generation is slightly fading into history a bit. But in the Falklands, they are conscious of that every day, particularly as when I was doing the job, which was from 2006 to 2008, we still had huge minefields everywhere laid by the Argentines in 1982, all around Stanley, the capital of the Falklands. Or there was a famous letter which was written by a particular Foreign Office minister about the sharing of revenues from any potential future oil and gas production in the Falklands. There's never been any yet, but it's much discussed. And the Falkland people knew absolutely every detail of that letter, whereas people in the UK might forget about it. Another example is when Chris Patten took over as governor of Hong Kong and pushed forward with democratic reforms. The Chinese said, well, hang on, what about this exchange of letters that we had a few years ago about the pace of democratic reform? And there's a lot of debate about whether Patten had been briefed on this exchange of letters or not, and something which he either didn't know about or hadn't been briefed about, or he hadn't given it enough importance, was fundamental for the Chinese. Or I remember being in Anguilla driving around with a local guy called Granville, the governor's driver, and he was telling me about the history of it and the 1967 revolution in Anguilla. I mean, who knew
Right.
about that? And how they'd objected to being part of St Kitts and Nevis. All these things fundamental. So that's one theme. Know the history of the places you're dealing with. The other theme, which we've already touched on really, is this rewriting of history by authoritarian regimes. Now, it's not just authoritarian regimes who rewrite history. History is a kind of living thing, and people can begin to focus in a quite organic and non-political way on, let's say, slavery, and say, well, let's have another look at this and reappraise our role in it and highlight, how bad it was. But that's not being directed by any central governmental agency. Whereas in authoritarian regimes, you have this use of rewriting history in such a way that whole countries begin to have only the vaguest grasp of things that happened. I mean, one example is the new use of school textbooks in Russia to explain why the so-called special military operation had to take place, saying Ukraine was run by Nazis and Russia was being threatened somehow militarily. Really scary. Or an older example, ask any Russian when World War II started, and they'll tell you it started in 1941 when the fascists attacked the peaceful Soviet Union. They'll never tell you that
Right.
about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact or the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939. Not because they're evil, but because they've just never been taught about it, Very interesting. I was looking this up the other day, and after the Soviet Union attacked Eastern Poland, what did they do? They annexed that territory, and they held fake elections, and they said 13.5 million Polish citizens are now Soviet citizens. So, this has been going on for a long time, but for the reasons we discussed earlier, of technology and more centralization of information and more use of AI and social media and so on, it's becoming more tempting for governments to try and rewrite history. And I think it's a very dangerous development.
Yeah, and in ways it's become easier too, as people nowadays digest history in a different way, right? They're getting small snippets on TikTok or Instagram or things like that, and they, see 3-minute clips and they think they know the history of an issue.
Yeah.
Well, Ambassador Turner, I really appreciate this. Thanks so much for taking the time. I think this has been a fascinating conversation. And best of luck on continued sales of the book. And everybody should go read Lessons in Diplomacy. And I appreciate you taking the time.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I hope to make a trip to the US possibly in February if I can scratch together the funding for it, and might come and see you there in Georgetown. Thank you very much for this discussion. I found it very, very interesting and illuminating.
Thank you again to Ambassador Leigh Turner for his time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.